Welcome to The Lead, the New Lines magazine podcast. I'm Salem, and this is a podcast where we delve into the biggest ideas, events, and personalities from around the world. With me today is Zahra Hankir. She's a Lebanese-British journalist, editor of Women on the Ground, and most recently, author of Eyeliner, A Culture History. Zahra traces the history of eyeliner from the ancient Egyptian queen Nefertiti to modern-day dancers in India and gaishus in Japan. Zahra, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Ola. I'm so excited to chat today.
Oh, so am I. I have to say, after reading a book, I can't look at eyeliner the same way again. I didn't realize before reading a book, it's like, how this small thing that many of us take for granted has actually meant so much more for so many people. And, as well as a cosmetic, product, it has been a status signifier and even a tool of rebellion. Just before we delve into your book on the history of eyeliner, I wanted to ask you, why eyeliner?
Yeah, it's a great question. Firstly, I want to say your eyeliner today is impeccable. So thank you for putting the effort
yours.
in there. Eyeliner is ubiquitous. So you kind of touched on that. It's almost like we see it everywhere, but I don't think people really see it for what it is and the depth that it carries and sort of the layers of history that it carries within it. And I had been wearing eyeliner for, really since I was about 12 or 13 years old. As I was coming of age, it was sort of the most important makeup product in my arsenal of makeup products. When I wasn't wearing any other makeup, I would always be wearing eyeliner. I initially was attracted to it because my mother used to put it on every morning in a very ritualistic way. When we lived in the UK, she was a mother of 6. She had so much going on in life and she was missing her family back home in Lebanon because we're Lebanese. And still every morning she kind of made the time to put the eyeliner on. It was like a moment of self-care that kind of transported her. And also, as the eyeliner that many people from the global South wear and use does not look like Western eyeliner. The pots are quite ornate. The product itself or the pigment itself is quite different than what you would find in a drugstore. So I always sort of had this understanding that this object connected me to something bigger than, what people assumed eyeliner to be. And that was actually to my heritage, right? And to, the Arab world, and I'm also part Egyptian, to being, part Egyptian. And I didn't learn the historical elements of it until later on as I was growing up. But I still had this idea that this object connected my mother and therefore me to something else, to our home and our heritage. So that's sort of like an overview of why I'm attracted to the product itself and to the history of the product. And then it wasn't until obviously much later on when I was exploring book ideas, I thought, wow, this could actually make for a really interesting book because it's an important product, not just in my region of origin and your region of origin, but also across the global South, right? And in so many different ways.
Yeah. You do something which I think people rarely do, which is, you took something that people wouldn't take so seriously, a makeup product. And you took us through this journey through time, geography, to show us how it can be taken very seriously, and it should be, because it's like the symbol of power, the symbol of womanhood, health, politics, and so much more. I just want to, how did you turn it into something so serious?
Yeah, absolutely. It's such a good question. And I have been asked actually if sort of this attention given to a makeup product or a cosmetic is in some way a little bit damaging because it plays into this idea of like women are expected to look a certain way and to make themselves up in a certain way. But the thing is, and what I try to say is that this is not just a makeup product. It is not, to me, it's not just a cosmetic, right? It carries within it so much meaning that goes far beyond beauty. And you've already touched on some of it. So, historically and through the centuries, eyeliner has been used as a form of conveying a person's spirituality or their religiosity. And we can get into that a little bit later on. It can be a way to sort of repel the evil eye. It has been used medicinally to treat the eye of various eye ailments, such as conjunctivitis. It's been used to strengthen the eyelashes. It's been used to protect against the glare of the sun. And it has been used as a form of like preserving and maintaining one's heritage and celebrating that heritage, particularly for people in the diaspora. And then also, amongst Bedouin communities, this has been something that they've been doing for centuries, and they continue to do it as a way of sort of maintaining that tradition. So to me, it's not just makeup. So when somebody sort of brings that argument to me, I immediately say, well, it's not the same as other forms of adornment, even though other forms of adornment can carry also different types of meanings that go beyond beauty as well. But it's extremely profound. And I personally no longer look at eyeliner in the same way. I always knew it carried weight, but I didn't realize it carries this much weight. And I always say now that when I put my eyeliner on in the morning, it feels heavier to me. The applicator feels heavier to me now. Yep.
So, a part of the book you talk about growing up in England, and as a Lebanese woman, and I discovered and was very excited about that you had Egyptian roots as well. So you talk about how you kind of wanted to blend in into this Western society, and I really saw parts of myself in that because I was born in Egypt. I'm an Egyptian woman. I was born in Egypt, and just under 4 months, that's when my family moved to England. And I grew up there, and that was also what I wanted to do. I just wanted to blend in, and obviously I looked different. I was in a different shape. My hair was curly. I don't have white skin. Had all these Middle Eastern features and Egyptian features. And I, for a long time, didn't want those features because I just wanted to blend in. And I really, reading what you went through and going through the same thing, it was just really fascinating that you kind of found confidence in eyeliner. And I still remember how there was one assembly in school where the teachers were kind of like telling the students they shouldn't wear such bold eye makeup. And everybody looked at me because they knew like the teachers were referencing me. But I mean, that didn't stop me. I've always loved eyeliner and the confidence, and it just gives me, and like the confidence it even gives people when I kind of play with eyeliner with them. And so it made me think of the first time I wore eyeliner, and I wonder if you remember the first time you wore eyeliner.
Thank you for sharing that, because I was a little bit hesitant at first to sort of include those personal anecdotes, but it really was a part of sort of my journey of sort of coming of age and self acceptance. Because when you are growing up, I mean, many people in the diaspora and women, people of color will relate, but when you are growing up in sort of a predominantly white society and you're sort of trying to fit in and come to terms with like just growing up by itself is difficult, but then growing up as someone who feels like they're being othered, you are constantly sort of looking to, there's this fine line, I think, between wanting to assimilate, but also wanting to express your sort of yourself and your heritage in a way. And that's a delicate dance that I definitely experienced. So thank you for sharing that you went through something similar. I think it was, or I recall the first time that I wore eyeliner quite vividly because it was applied to my eyes by an older friend of mine. Her name is May, an Egyptian girl. And we had bonded because, like, clearly we were, non British, and Arab, and we related to one another, and we came from conservative homes as well. And I was just hanging out with her one day, and she just said, "Hey, let me sort of make you over." And then she applied the eyeliner quite sort of vividly and distinctly to my eyes. And that was the first time I saw myself in eyeliner. And I say in the book that I felt like I had come into focus for the first time because, as I'm sure you will have experienced too, it's like the way that it stencils the eyes kind of makes the eyes pop in a way and accentuates, especially if you're of like Arab or Middle Eastern background. We already have these like big eyes, right? But it like accentuates them, makes them really pop. And I feel like that was the first time that I looked at myself and thought like, oh, I can see, like I could see that I'm like a girl, like growing up, and that's such a vivid memory for me. And I will always remember May for that reason, because she had that confidence, right? And I was like trying to emulate that because she was older than me. So yeah, that was the first of many times, and also the first of many bonding experiences that I've had with women over the years who wear eyeliner. I've put on eyeliner in like school bathrooms behind my teacher's back, or like I did it like, in nightclubs in Beirut with my friends. We all have these like unique memories of like when we put our eyeliner on, and it's often a communal event. I like to say, because it's like a very precise art that you have to learn and pick up sometimes. So it can be helpful to experience that with groups.
So I want to talk about your first chapter. You write Nefertiti was firmly established in Western minds as a beauty icon and a symbol of female empowerment. Now, why do you think that is? Why do you think that she became basically the golden standard for exotic beauty in the West?
Yeah, this is such a great question. It's something I have been pondering for years. Now, I think it's important to know that our conception of Nefertiti's beauty derives from her bust, right? Her bust was excavated by archaeologists from the deserts of Egypt over 100 years ago, and then transported. I like to put transported in like quotations, because like I would say that it was stolen or like, and that the bus should return to Egypt, but transported to Berlin and then displayed to the public in 1923, 1924. The pictures of her were released in 1923, and then the public was able to visit her in 1924. Now, at this point in time, um, the image of her, this sort of perfectly symmetrical face with very sharp angular features, with heavily lined eyes. I wouldn't even say heavily. I would say it's kind of subtle, actually, but distinct. Subtle but distinct. And then with the very high sort of crown, she has like a slightly androgynous look, but she's also just very regal. And I think that people were very taken aback by this idea of this being an Egyptian queen, and also to them being almost palatable, because she was presented in such a way that they would find attractive, but not too different than their own features or themselves. It's almost like a sort of they can see themselves in it, but then they also notice that she's also exotic, right? And there's a lot of speculation as to whether or not the bust itself is real. I mean, generally, archaeologists believe it to be an authentic bust, but that's how much speculation or like swirling narratives there were around Nefertiti because she was so beautiful. It was almost like, can she be truly a woman of color or an Egyptian queen? Can she be this beautiful? Or actually, is she actually European, and is this bust even real? So that's sort of the extent to which people were fascinated by her beauty. And I think also let me be clear, she was definitely a woman of color and an Egyptian queen. I just want to say that. I'm just noting the sort of speculation around her looks. I think also at the time, sort of the beauty world, so to speak, was quite fertile at the time, because it was like, an era of sort of like women, experimenting with their looks, wearing makeup, flappers, had become a thing. And this was like a time period during which women were experimenting with their looks. So now they had this image of this like very beautiful queen that they wanted to emulate, or they sought to emulate in some way. And how would you do that, right? You would do that by trying to mimic the way this person looks. And the tools that they used were eyeliner. Sometimes they wore high hats and big collar necklaces. As you know, she wore this big collar necklace. And, busts or replicas of the busts started to appear all around the world in like hair salons in America, for example, where people started to emulate her look. So I feel like there's almost an enigma about her, based solely on the bust. Also, we don't know much about her life. That's what's so interesting about Nefertiti. We have some like sort of overarching facts that we know about her, but there's still a lot of question marks about her. But we do know that she ruled alongside her husband Akhenaten at a very sort of revolutionary time in ancient Egypt, and that she held quite a serious position or place of authority alongside him when he wielded his power. So she wasn't sort of like a submissive, timid queen. She really did have major impact. So I think the combination of those two things, of knowing that she had this sort of very important place in Egyptian history, her beauty as it is depicted on the bust, and then knowing also that we don't really know everything about her. All of these things combined just make her, I think, such a sort of special, very fascinating figure in history.
Right. I mean, one of the quotes that you had in the book, which was, I mean, I found it quite horrifying, to be honest, from this 1945 feature from Vogue and Vanity Fair that described Kulthum as quote unquote not beautiful. And, they talk about how women, like Egyptian women in general, were not beautiful. So yeah, that was, I mean, how did you feel when you read that?
Absolutely the same. It's why I included the quote. Again, I think there was this obsession of trying to understand, why are we so attracted to this, bust? What is it about her? And it's like simultaneously the attraction is because she's exotic looking, but also that they're almost sort of repulsed by the idea that they would be attracted to something exotic looking.
Yeah, no, definitely. Like I found it really amazing that you dug up all these old stories from the 30s and even before of, capturing what news stories in the West were saying, A, after the bust was discovered, and then B, talking about Arab women. And it's really fascinating to, I mean, like kudos to you to do that. I do wonder, I mean, because I think you traveled to Berlin, right, to see the bust in person. How did it feel to learn about Middle East and your, heritage in the West, from the West?
This is a tricky one because I grew up in the UK. As I mean, you spent some of your life there too, and I put a lot of effort into learning about my own region through, to the best of my ability, people who wrote about our own, about the region, who come from the region. And as you know, with my first book, I try to amplify those voices, people from the region who write about our region. I think this chapter on Nefertiti was to understand what her place was in Western society, to situate her within the growth trajectory of eyeliner. She played a really big role there. And therefore, to do that, to learn about the history of how she was perceived, I had to, look at primarily Western sources and how she was written about. And the discourse around her was so Orientalist, and nothing that, I wouldn't have potentially guessed in a way. But when you really delve into it, some of it was really, uh, I mean, shocking in a way, maybe not shocking. I remember there's one point in a Vogue piece where the author says something like, these veiled Muslim women like teasing us men, and like then he mentioned something about their hygiene, and I'm like, oh, this kind of thing is really disturbing, but important to understand how she was perceived, and then therefore an extension of how like women like us might have been perceived at that time, or maybe continue to be perceived in different ways, right? And one component of the research which I particularly enjoyed, that I'm sure you can relate to, is how Nefertiti is viewed in Egypt, right? And the differences between how she's written about in Egypt or in our region of origin, and how she's written about in the West, and how she's celebrated as this like queen and icon of beauty and power in a very sort of honorific way in Egypt, and then seeing sort of how the discourse was quite different in the West. So that was interesting to compare the two. And that's something that I think probably you're aware of in Egypt, like her place in Egypt. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, looking at the other thing I was, thinking about is, she obviously she was seen as the golden standards of exotic beauty in the West, but it made me think about how in the East until today, there's still the golden standard of beauty is still very, to have a Caucasian look, to be white, to have, white skin, straight hair, blue eyes, and the fairer the better, just and there's still, so much racism towards dark skinned Arabs, and a dislike for curly hair and dark hair. And like, I mean, I remember growing up and being taught, before the hair straightener, before GHD era, of ways of how to kind of like tie your hair around your head to kind of like, and they called it dawama, to straighten it. And, all these beauty products, even like this whole industry was very lovely of these products being sold to us to kind of get us to be more white. Um, I just found it interesting the how this Egyptian woman was admired in the West, whilst we were still, and until today, trying to look more Western.
Unfortunately, 100 years later, not much has changed. That's what I try to argue in the book. I say that Nefertiti was the original beauty influencer because I feel like, she very clearly influenced makeup trends and eyeliner, throughout the 1900s based on the research that I did. But I think it's important to note also that while women were emulating her in certain ways, they were cherry picking. So they were cherry picking the eyeliner. There were pieces in beauty magazines that said, don't darken your skin though. Like, that's dark skin is not something that you should do, cautioning against looking too exotic, right? And you still see that kind of cherry picking today, actually in a more enhanced way because of social media. And I mentioned in the final chapter of the book, the quote unquote Instagram face. This is a term that Gia Tolentino of the New Yorker came up with, this idea of like having an amalgamation of different features. We've kind of moved on from the Instagram face to like what I would call the snatched face now, but it's still this idea of let's take certain features from different ethnic and racial groups and apply them to a Eurocentric face, right? So you're still very much adhering to that white sort of supremacist view of beauty, but you're actually, taking some exotic features to meet certain trends, so-called trends, when really these are not trends. These are features that people are from our ethnicities and ethnic backgrounds are born with, right? So that trend still exists today. It's still just as problematic. Fox eye is a trend that I mentioned in the book, which is like a trend that many models popularize, where they try to make the eye lengthen the eye to make it look slightly slanted, which of course is very, very offensive to people of particular backgrounds who have eyes that are shaped that way naturally, right? So, these, and I quote some of these people who criticize that as being offensive to them, and particularly people of East Asian origin. So, I mean, this was something that was striking to me, how 100 years later, really not much has changed, even though there have been efforts to diversify the beauty industry and to celebrate, diverse, or, I hate using the word diverse sometimes, but like different types of beauty. We still have a long way to go. I think the idea is you really should be, rather than fetishizing, you should be humanizing. And if you are, you know, using certain elements of a culture that have been celebrated and used in that culture for centuries, then there should at least be some sensitivity towards that and acknowledgement of that.
One question I think I haven't touched upon about, I did get, I understood it from your book, and I do want to hear it from you though, is how would you define how eyeliner is tied to power, and for women in particular?
I mean, it's extremely inherently tied, I think. And I explore, as you know, many different cultures in the book, where it is used as a tool to convey some form of, let's say, agency. And I think the two that really come to mind are, firstly, the Mexican American Chola community. And that is sort of the group in predominantly, well, in the United States, but predominantly in California, who really have a very distinct aesthetic. And as part of that aesthetic, they line their eyes quite heavily. And the sort of roots of that aesthetic were actually born in the climate of discrimination that Mexican Americans experienced when they came to America. And as part of that sort of reaction to the pressure to assimilate, they actually came up with a very, very distinct look. It started as the Pachuca look, and then it became the Chola look. So therefore, it's inherently tied to their identity, right? The wearing of eyeliner in a particular way, which goes back to how women wore eyeliner in Mexico, and continue to, has to do with sort of a form of pride of their own, look and their aesthetic, right? So they're proud, they're brown, they're saying this is what we look like, we're not going to change that, we don't care if you identify us in a particular way. And so I found amongst the Mexican American women that I spoke to that it is a sort of tool for them, almost a political tool, whereby they're really asserting their identities in the face of that pressure to assimilate. And I really, really found that to be very powerful and moving within the context of that community. And again, the chola look has been appropriated in very insensitive ways over the years. So that's another important point to make. Now, also in Iran, I think it's very nuanced in Iran, but I still think it's important to note is that, in Iran, women's bodies, as we know, are police. So like the decision to aesthetically enhance your face in particular ways is very intentional, especially when you wear makeup, especially when you wear nail polish, lipstick, eyeliner, especially when you wear your clothes in a certain way, you choose different colors and that kind of thing. It's very intentional. So eyeliner has been worn, of course, also in Iran for centuries because it's called sorme there when it is made from natural materials. It has been worn historically in sort of some of the ways that we listed earlier, medicinally to protect the eyes, to express religiosity, and so on. So it takes on kind of a nuanced context in Iran because I do want to say that sorme or kahal, as eyeliner is known in its earliest iterations, was said to have been worn by the Prophet Muhammad per hadith. So that would make it sunnah, permissible for Muslim communities to wear eyeliner in a way that's not necessarily to enhance the eye aesthetically, but for other purposes, to sort of mimic the Prophet, the ways of the Prophet, as we know. So the wearing of sorme has almost like been sort of considered permissible. But then if you wear eyeliner in a very distinct way to enhance the face, to attract attention to it, that's where it crosses into sort of different territory. So that's a nuance that I explored in the chapter in Iran, because obviously, presenting yourself in a way that attracts attention is forbidden there. And the use of makeup is really nuanced as well. But still, sorme and eyeliner have been used based on the people that I spoke to in the research that I did as a way for these women to assert, this is my identity. This is how I want to look, despite the restrictions imposed upon us. Now, I don't want to be trite and say that this is necessarily strictly a political object, but it is still an object that can potentially be used to assert that, this is how the woman wants to present despite restrictions. And particularly after Mahsa Amini's death, and as we know, I'm sure you've covered extensively, there are a lot of women who start to experiment more, especially online, with their looks, where they would have very distinct eyeliner wings, especially amongst the younger generation. So that was really interesting to observe as well.
Yeah, I mean that's I've always found that fascinating how certain cultures kind of like draw the line or conservative places between halal of the eyeliner and the haram of it, because like you said, the Prophet Muhammad used it. And I think I used that probably as a very early argument as a teen to my parents, saying why it's okay that I'm wearing eyeliner, such thick eyeliner. And their response would be, yeah, but not this kind of eyeliner, where you kind of like, making it so bold. And it's pretty amazing how you traveled and how deeply, kohl or eyeliner was, it's embedded in various cultures that, from the Nomads in Chad and which you visited to Japan. So was the culture range of eyeliner a surprise to you?
I was definitely aware that eyeliner is used in different ways across all of these cultures. I think what I really enjoyed, an element of the research, was like the through line, right? So there's this sort of this item of makeup has been used historically across these cultures in different ways, and at the same time, they will have commonalities and similarities. For example, the idea of repelling the evil eye. Now, this obviously was very much present in ancient Egypt, and it was one of the reasons why eyeliner was worn. But then you also see it in Arab culture. You also see it in Japanese culture, whereby like the wearing of red eyeliner is considered a way of repelling the evil spirit. So this is worn by geisha in Japan. And then you also see in Indian, South Asian culture. So you just have this sort of broad range of different cultures with very distinct sort of approaches to their aesthetic and their histories. But there's this through line of like, well, they're using eyeliner for a similar purpose. And I think the interesting thing is, obviously the eye is sort of so central to our being, right? And it's just this idea of protecting the eye by drawing these lines around the eye is sort of, it's almost obvious when you think about it, but it was really interesting just to study historically and to go through the text some ancient texts and so on to see the commonalities there. So I thought that that was really fascinating, but also just, the different approaches to the idea of beauty. Like beauty definitely varies from culture to culture, right? I mean, in Chad, the idea of what is beautiful amongst this nomadic group is not the same as what would be considered beautiful in sort of Western Eurocentric culture. So that was also really interesting to see the role that eyeliner plays in conceptions of beauty, because in Chad, they consider sort of the darkness of the eyeliner contrasting with the whiteness of the eye, the darkness of one's lips, which they would have very dark lipstick on, against the whiteness of the teeth and that kind of thing. So that was also interesting too.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting even how a lot of these translated to beauty products now. Like, a lot of people would even use like eye drops as part of their beauty routine to kind of whiten the white parts even more. Or, people putting in veneers to have whiter teeth or so on. So it seems like a lot of these, as soon as a lot of the beauty standards from different cultures come into the mainstream, the beauty industry is very happy to kind of like, jump on it to kind of profit from it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wonder as well. I mean, your book, you released it in November, and as the whole world is watching Middle East and the Palestinian-Israel war. How was the reception of the book? Because I did see you write on social media. It's kind of difficult to kind of speak about your book during such a difficult time.
Yeah, I'm grateful for you for asking that question. It was a strange time, because obviously I was consumed and continue to be consumed was with what is happening in Gaza and Palestine, and I felt almost a form of guilt to even be considering discussing my book at that time, when really all of my energies and thoughts and any platforming I was doing was focused on Palestine. At the same time, it did bring to mind what my mother had told me when I was initially pitching the idea of this book, because my first book dealt with very serious, heavy themes. Arab Women on the Ground, a collection of essays by Arab women journalists. And I just sort of felt it might seem jarring for me to go from that kind of serious topic to the topic of eyeliner. And my mother made the point that, this is also a serious exploration and a study of the beauty of our culture. And these are things that we should be proud of. These are things that we should also devote time to researching and amplifying. And that the stories of sort of joy and beauty out of our culture are just as important as the stories of tragedy that come out of our culture as well, sadly, and what we experience or what is imposed upon us. So I've kept that with me as an idea, because at the time, actually, the Beirut blast had happened when I was initially exploring this idea, and I've kept my mother's words with me, and I do believe very firmly that this is right. Like, this is something that we should celebrate, and this also leads me to another point of the idea of cultural preservation and heritage. What is happening in Palestine right now is you have serious efforts to erase or undermine historical heritage and culture. And the coal making, kohal making, is actually a very important part of sort of Gazan culture, specifically in Gaza. There are many older women, grandmothers, who make kahal at home and who impart those traditions onto their daughters, who then impart them onto their daughters. And it's a part of Palestinian tradition and culture and heritage. And maintaining that heritage is very, very important in the face of cultural erasure. So for me, I also have been trying to reframe how I think about eyeliner in that way as well, is that it is a fundamental part of Arab culture and other cultures, communities of color around the world, and that to write about it and to explore it is an extension of that form of preserving the heritage and also celebrating the heritage at the same time.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you as well. You speak a bit about like how these small businesses kind of like in the early days used eyeliner and Nefertiti as a way for expression for artists, particularly artists of color and Black artists. And you touched a little bit on the controversy of a Netflix documentary series on African queens, where Cleopatra, who was of Greek descent, as a Black, she was portrayed as a Black African woman, and having, a Black female expert in the trailer insisting that Cleopatra was Black. Um, You seemed a little bit impartial to that, so I kind of wanted to ask, what were your thoughts of that?
Yeah, my goal in the book really was to present facts and to allow people to come to their own conclusion. For me, the subject of race in ancient Egypt, and there is an expert who said this, and several have said this. It's almost like anachronistic because it's like we're applying modern conceptions of race to an ancient period, right? So I think that that's important to note. I think in terms of the facts, we do know that Cleopatra did have Greek Macedonian descent. We also know she may have had some African descent, maybe potentially from her mother's side. Um, Now, I think the sort of obsession with portraying her as sort of white previously, I feel like the current portrayal of her in the current moment as black should not be as problematic as it has been made to be. I feel like this idea of the proximity to whiteness is sort of something that people have been obsessing over for centuries, really, and the idea of whiteness and white supremacy. At the same time, I don't think we should neglect facts. Like I think it is perfectly okay to say that she was of Greek and Macedonian descent, and it's very likely that she was not dark skinned, right? So um, I think the sort of outrage around it was just overdone and not necessary. But I also think it's perfectly fine to look at the facts and to say, and also an important fact about Cleopatra was that she was most likely not as beautiful as she has been portrayed as being. I
Yeah,
mean,
I noticed the little shade that you threw at Cleopatra in the book.
yeah. I mean, it wasn't like shade. It was more like our obsession with having to make her seem beautiful because she was able to seduce, who she seduced or like have the power that she wielded. We don't have to make her into a beautiful woman, and I think there is that obsession around her beauty, and also her race. I think again it feels anachronistic to me. I think with Nefertiti it's particularly interesting because we know for sure that she was a woman of color, but even then we do not know her precise racial background. There are theories that she may have been of the Mitanni kingdom, which is of Syrian or Levantine descent. She may have been Egyptian. But we, again, like there's also debate around Nefertiti and her race and her being depicted as black amongst the Afrocentric movement, whereby she's not considered as black by Egyptian authorities, right? And it's just this obsession with trying to say she's not black to me is inherently problematic when she very likely could have been, and we actually don't really know, and we probably will never know. So I think there's a lot here to unpack, but my role as an author was really just to lay out the facts, what is known, and also to lay out sort of the perceptions of her. Like I think it is particularly with Nefertiti understandable that you would have black artists celebrating her as a queen of color or a black queen. It's understandable that they would be doing that, and that's not something that I would oppose. It's something that I celebrate as well, even though, as I say in the book, we actually do not know officially what her
Yeah.
race was. We know that she was a woman of color for sure.
That's really interesting. I mean, I have to kind of jump in as an Egyptian woman to kind of put the Egyptian argument is that there's a movement that kind of feels like trying to strip away modern Egyptians from their heritage, and I think a lot of anger comes from that. It's not per se because it was portrayed by a black woman. That is absolutely no problem because we've never really had Egyptian women on the big screen portraying Egyptians. We've always had people from different colors or ethnicities. Or we had, like I was looking up an article yesterday, like all the people in history who've kind of played Egyptian queens, and they're all foreign. And it's only very recently when we kind of had Egyptian actors kind of representing. But yeah, the notion of a black woman playing Cleopatra isn't the issue at all. It was the idea of trying to take away um, Egyptian heritage from the Egyptians, to say that some conspiracies saying that we were put into Egypt as kind of like by the Europeans and we have no ties to our culture, no ties to our Egyptian queens. And I think that was what was the argument from Egypt's side.
Yeah, sure, sure. I think there is an element, I think, of racism, unfortunately, that's not necessarily what you're talking about. I think that different groups and different people try to co-opt arguments in different ways. But I think that your point is really important. I also want to make the point that, Egypt is like a multiracial society and very likely, was
Yeah.
multiracial in ancient Egypt as well. And that's an important point to make as well, that we don't need to be absolutely 100% sure that Egyptians looked one way, because they looked very, very different. But it's that idea, right, of like, what is beautiful, portraying an Egyptian queen, at the time as white, even, or she's of course of Greek ancestry, was palatable to the West. It's palatable because she was able to then have this exotic aesthetic, but actually she was fair skinned. And this is very palatable to the West, right? So I think that obviously what we're seeing now is a counter to that. And even if it might not be 100% accurate, I think that that's a reaction to some of that obsession to the proximity with whiteness, right? Even though I understand, of course, what you're saying about the Egyptian reaction as well. But I think all of that is really important because you see that like this object, eyeliner, has all of these arguments swirling around it. And it's kind of shocking when you think about it. But like this, the popularity of Cleopatra impacted eyeliner sales. And that all has to do with the conception of beauty at the time. What I want people to take away from the book is that, there is really so much more to eyeliner than meets the eye. So when you're putting eyeliner on, I want people to realize that like it has all of that history there, and the history is there to be learned, and I would love for people to look at eyeliner in a different way after reading this book, in the same way you feel about eyeliner as well. I feel like I'm adorning my face with my heritage when I put eyeliner on, and I won't deny that it makes me look better. I will say that, but it's more than that.
I love that. Awesome. Thank you so much, Zahra.
Thank you, Ala. This has been such a delight. I appreciate it.
This has been The Lead from New Lines Magazine. You can buy Zahra's book, Eyeliner, A Culture History, in all good bookstores, and follow her on Twitter at Zahra Hankir. This week's episode was produced by Finbar Anderson and hosted by me, Ala Salem. For more like this, subscribe to The Lead on your favorite podcast app and visit our website, newlinesmag.com. Please rate us in your favorite podcast app. It really helps us grow a big audience. And see you next week.